Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Babbel. Click the link in the description to get 60% off your subscription and start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. The United States has invaded and colonized numerous islands, territories, and countries over its almost 250-year tenure as a nation. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Africa became the target of colonization by numerous countries. Europeans literally scrambled to claim land and exploit the continent's resources and people for profit. No other region of the planet has ever been colonized at the rate Africa was during this time period. Surprisingly, the US was not one of the colonizers. So why didn't the United States join in the scramble for Africa? The reason is not what you might think. Many in the United States refuse to believe that their democratic republic would ever colonize and oppress people in other parts of the world, similar to how Britain had done to the 13 American colonies. But that's exactly what it's done over the years. Interestingly, the US fits all the characteristics of an empire. The United States still holds island territories such as Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam. All of these territories are technically part of the United States, but don't have the same rights or receive the same aid that the states do. Basically, U.S. territories are just a different name given to lands that are U.S. colonies. Traditionally, colonies are used to provide resources or a source of income to the nation that colonized it. This is what drove the colonization of Africa, and the United States followed this practice in parts of Latin America and the Pacific. But why didn't the U.S. ever try to colonize territories in Africa when it was clear at the time that such a venture would be lucrative? Before we can answer this question, we need to examine who ended up colonizing Africa and why. This, along with what was happening in the US at the time, is the key to answering this intriguing question. The Scramble for Africa is the name given to the time period between 1885 and 1914 when European powers began rapidly colonizing the continent. Up to this point in history, there were only a handful of small colonies along the coast of the continent set up by the Portuguese and the Dutch. Most of the ports and European settlements in Africa were used as staging grounds to transport African people across the Atlantic during the slave trade. This was by far one of the darkest periods in human history. As more and more countries in Europe abolished the use of slaves and slave trading became illegal across much of the planet, nations needed a new source of income. Simultaneously, without free labor, the prices of goods started to increase. This led European powers to start looking toward the largest and most importantly closest continent with uncolonized land in the world, Africa. As colonies in the Americas continued to rise up against their European rulers on the other side of the Atlantic, these territories began to be seen as more trouble than they were worth. Due to the difficulty of maintaining colonies that were an ocean away, European powers began to focus on the largely unexplored continent directly to their south. However, there were several problems with exploring the middle of Africa, such as the vastness of its deserts, the denseness of its jungles, and the lack of infrastructure on the continent. This meant that for the most part, European explorers had pretty much always stayed close to the coast. However, by the 19th century, more and more private ventures were launched into Africa for a variety of reasons. The African Association, created by several extremely wealthy Englishmen, funded an expedition into the middle of the continent to locate the fabled city of Timbuktu. A byproduct of this expedition was the charting of the Niger River, which would later be used by future expeditions to penetrate further into Africa. As time progressed, the exploration of Africa shifted from trying to locate lost cities to looking for resource-rich regions to colonize. The United States during the same period was doing the same thing as European powers were. However, for the most part, they stuck to exploration of the western part of North America. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the U.S. had more than doubled its territory seemingly overnight. There was a lot of land to inventory and resources to take stock of. Slavery was still legal in the U.S., and although the country had ambitions outside of its own borders, the only importance the early U.S. put on Africa was the main source of slave labor. The wealthy corporations and American government had no interest in exploring the African continent or colonizing its lands when there was so much to do at home. However, European countries needed resources desperately to keep up with the demand of both their wealthy and middle-class citizens. Since there was very little undeveloped land left on the European continent, they needed to look elsewhere to find the resources needed to keep their economies running. The dense and growing population of the continent had all but used up its limited resources, which was one of the reasons that Europe needed colonies so desperately. Although the U.S. itself did not play a role in the colonization of Africa, one of its citizens did. In the second half of the 19th century, Henry Morton Stanley, who would later become a naturalized American citizen, was tasked with finding Dr. Livingstone in the deep jungles of Africa. To be fair, Stanley was actually working for King Leopold II of Belgium, not the United States, during his exploration of Africa. At the same time he was searching for Dr. Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley was also given the assignment to secure treaties with local chieftains along the Congo River to create a Belgian colony in Africa. The Belgian government did not have enough money to fund a large-scale colony in Africa, which led them to only secure the Congo. However, other countries in Europe did have the means and the money to stake claims in the African continent. Stanley's expedition brought the word back to Europe that there was opportunity there, leading other governments to send their own envoys to secure land on the continent. As the 19th century neared its end, the American Civil War led to the abolishment of slavery in the U.S., leading slave trading companies in Europe to pivot their strategies to more legitimate forms of trade. The United States had been torn apart by the Civil War and would spend the next several decades rebuilding the country and expanding its territory further to the west. This would eventually lead to a war with Mexico, which would result in more land being acquired by the U.S. What this meant was that the U.S. was concentrated on colonizing North America and couldn't care less about what was going on in Africa. European nations, on the other hand, saw the African continent as a new venture where they could make large sums of money by setting up plantations for cash crops, which could then be shipped back to Europe and around the world. The products they were after included rubber, coffee, sugar, and timber, among other goods that could not be procured in Europe. But perhaps one of the biggest reasons that this was the perfect time for European nations to colonize Africa was due to advances in transportation, in particular the advancement of steam engines, which allowed for faster train and ship travel. Iron-hulled vessels and steamships could now navigate shallower waters, allowing them to travel along the rivers of Africa. This, combined with the construction of railroads across the continent, allowed for easier transportation of goods to the coast, where they could be sent back to Europe. Advances in propulsion were not the only new technology that allowed Europeans to colonize Africa. Deadlier weapons were designed, and groundbreaking advances in medicine meant that malaria could be treated, allowing Europeans to survive the harsher environments of Africa. Up until this point, Africa had been known as the white man's grave due to the high mortality rates from malaria and yellow fever on the continent. These advances allowed Europeans to not just explore but thrive in Africa. Between the 1880s and 1920s, European countries carved out colonies in Africa, ravaged the lands, and exploited the people living there. It was a different kind of atrocity than the slave trade, but an atrocity nonetheless. By the early 20th century, 7 different countries had colonies in Africa, but the United States wasn't one of them. Or was it? Although the US did not colonize Africa the same way as nations of Europe did, saying the US didn't have any colonies on the continent is not entirely accurate. In 1847, the United States founded a small colony in Africa. The purpose of this colony was not to acquire slave labor or to exploit resources. Instead, a group of white Americans founded a corporation called the American Colonization Society that had one goal: resettle black people back into Africa. They planned to do this by founding the colony of Liberia. Make no mistake, the ACS was not helping black people return to their homeland out of the kindness of their hearts. In reality, they had some pretty messed up reasons for creating their colony in Africa. The American Colonization Society was created as part of the plan to deal with what they considered a problem brewing in the United States of America. That problem was free black people. Many people believed there was no way that free blacks and whites could coexist in a society. Obviously, this was a terrible and incredibly racist way to think. The crazy part was that many of the people who thought this way and were founders of the ACS were abolitionists. The American Colonization Society was made up of a group of white men with differing ideas about black people. The organization consisted of both slave owners and abolitionists, and as time progressed, many of the latter eventually rejected the idea that black and white people would never be able to coexist in society together. However, this did not stop the ACS from eventually starting their colony in Africa. The organization was made up of some very powerful and rich men who made sure that the colonists were well supplied. In 1818, the ACS sent 2 representatives to Western Africa where they would negotiate with local leaders on the price of their land. 2 years later, 88 free black settlers from the United States, along with 3 members of the American Colonization Society, set sail for Sierra Leone, where they bring a signed constitution to ensure the new colony would be settled under U.S. laws. The first spot that the new colonists landed was Cherbourg Island, just off the coast of Africa. Unfortunately, the colonists were ravaged by malaria and many died. Then in 1821, a United States naval ship carrying more settlers made it to the coast of Africa and continued the mission of the ACS. Upon disembarking from the ship, the colonists began looking for a more permanent settlement. They decided to set up shop in present-day Liberia. The native peoples initially refused to sell their land to the Americans, but eventually a naval officer wore down one of the chiefs who agreed to sell them a strip of land. The Navy moved the colonists that remained on Cherbourg Island to the newly acquired territory that would become the only U.S. colony in Africa. However, not everyone wanted them there. Local tribes continually attacked the colonists to the point where they had to build fortifications around their settlement. When their settlement was finally secured, the colonists named their town Monrovia, after President James Monroe, who had provided the colonization efforts with government funding and support. After Monrovia was established, other people in the ACS began purchasing land in the surrounding region, and more American settlers went to Africa. Freed black people rescued from slave ships by the United States Navy after the transatlantic slave trade was put to an end were dropped off on the shores of Liberia. The African people on these ships were not originally from the Liberian part of the continent, but this didn't seem to matter to the U.S. By 1838, Liberia contained around 20,000 colonists, some of whom were white, but the majority of which were black. The towns of U.S. settlers pretty much kept to themselves and did not try to integrate with the native tribes still living in the region. They clung desperately to their U.S. culture, trying to make Liberia a spitting image of their former home. As would be expected for a colony that was started by people halfway across the world, Liberia embraced trade and commerce. They were not receiving much aid from the United States and needed to quickly become self-sufficient. As European powers colonized and exploited the resources of Africa, the use of ports along the coast to ship goods back to Europe was a necessity. Luckily, Liberia was uniquely positioned on the continent to act as a harbor for these ships. However, because the United States was so far away, and as time went on, the American government cared less and less about Liberia, European powers began to encroach on its territory and business. This lack of involvement shown by the U.S. in Liberia's affairs eventually led to the colony declaring its independence in 1847 and becoming a sovereign state. This meant that the only U.S. colony in Africa lasted less than 30 years. And if truth be told, the U.S. government had very little interest in the colonization and growth of Liberia anyway. The colony was mainly the creation of private investors and the messed-up vision of the American Colonization Society. Liberia was more of a colony started by U.S. citizens than it was a colony of the United States itself. This brings us to the main reasons why the U.S. never took to colonizing Africa. Some of them have already been touched on, but there are other factors in play that kept the United States away from the African continent even while European powers were fighting with one another to colonize its lands. One of the main reasons the United States didn't colonize Africa was that it already had vast amounts of resources within its borders. The country was relatively young, and its population was slowly growing. But there was still much land to be explored and exploited on the continent. The countries in Europe did not have the luxury of having unexploited resource-rich lands within their own borders. Therefore, they needed to colonize Africa. If the United States had never grown beyond the 13 original colonies, there might have been a chance that they would have had needed to colonize Africa to secure more resources, but this was not the case. The U.S. had everything it needed to thrive and grow on its home continent. Make no mistake, the United States did technically colonize parts of North America that they did not control. Like with European powers in Africa, the United States sent its military to forcibly remove indigenous peoples from the lands so they could exploit their lands. The U.S. didn't need to wage a war against the African people and set up colonies halfway around the world while they could do it in the comfort of their own backyard. What it came down to for the U.S. was that trying to colonize the lands of Africa at the same time as European countries just wasn't worth it. The vast amount of resources in the Americas was more than enough to keep the economy and infrastructure of the U.S. going strong. It just didn't make sense for the U.S. to devote huge amounts of men and resources to secure colonies in Africa. Other than already having large amounts of resources close by, there was another major reason that the United States never colonized Africa. To put it simply, there was very little profit in it. If colonizing Africa would have provided the United States with vast amounts of wealth, there's a chance that the government would have sent troops and colonists across the ocean to make it happen. However, the expense of colonizing and maintaining colonies across the Atlantic Ocean far outweighed the gains that would have been brought in. As the 19th and 20th centuries progressed, the United States set its sights on colonizing islands in the Pacific as refueling stations for their ships to reach East Asia. Unlike colonizing Africa, this was a very profitable venture, which is why the U.S. still controls territories in the Pacific today. Even though the United States never really colonized Africa other than Liberia, it did colonize several other parts of the world. Again, people in the U.S. rarely acknowledge this, and it's not taught in many schools. One of the motivating factors for colonization by the U.S. was power. The U.S. used colonies to spread its influence and maintain power in certain regions of the world. Islands such as Hawaii before it became a state, or the Philippines before it gained independence, were technically U.S. colonies. This was not the name given to them because it would have looked like the U.S. was trying to build an empire, which was not aligned with how the Republic presented itself. What's nuts is that when we think of the United States, we normally picture the continental 48 states. Sometimes Hawaii and Alaska are incorporated into that image. However, the land that is the United States actually is much larger when we take into consideration all of its territories. And although Africa should not be included on a map of the United States colonies, many other parts of the world should be. Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands should all be considered part of the United States as they're all U.S. territories. This doesn't even include the military bases the U.S. has throughout the world to ensure their influence is represented within other countries' borders. While Europe was colonizing Africa, the United States was positioning itself to project its influence across the globe. It would be many decades before this dream would become a reality, but it did start with a choice to expand westward and seize land that was not only closer to home, but also resource-rich and highly lucrative. When we look at the planet today, around 4 million U.S. nationals live in parts of the world other than the 50 states represented by the stars on the American flag. Most of these people live in territories still under the control of the United States. Not granting long-held territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands statehood is problematic for a country that prides itself on being the leader of the free world, because when it comes down to it, these islands are just colonies. For people who even know a little bit about the United States' dark past, it comes as no surprise why certain territories never became states. When the U.S. defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, it gained a lot of territory that consisted of populations that were not white. This posed a problem, as it meant the U.S. government needed to decide what to do with these newly acquired lands and the people who lived in them. Would they become U.S. states and U.S. citizens? If so, all the people living in places like the Philippines, which had a relatively large population, would be able to vote in elections and would need representation in the government. With this representation, the laws of the United States that had kept a certain demographic, aka white men, in power, might have been challenged as new cultures integrated themselves into the fabric of U.S. society. Many of the men in the U.S. government at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War were adamant that the Philippines and other newly acquired territories would be profitable for the United States. However, they were even more adamant that these territories should not become states. This means that even though the United States did not like to admit it, it now controlled colonies just like European empires. The racist practices and thoughts of the U.S. government at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were definitely motivating factors as to why some territories became states and others didn't. Now imagine what would have happened if the U.S. had colonized large parts of Africa. It would have been incredibly hard to justify carving out regions of the continent like European powers did and not admitting that the United States was an empire. If the United States had tried to colonize Africa, it would have put the government in a similar position as it was with the Philippines. Although much of Filipino history is never discussed in U.S. textbooks or history classes, what they did there was terrible. The Philippines was a United States territory from 1898 until 1946, when it finally became a sovereign nation. At the time, the Philippine Islands were home to millions of people. In fact, during the 1940s, Manila would have been one of the 10 largest cities in the United States if it had become a state. This meant that a U.S. territory that had more people and larger cities than most states in the U.S. still wouldn't be granted statehood. Again, as terrible as it is when looking back at history, the key determinant of whether a U.S.-held territory would eventually become a state was how large the white population was within its borders. Just look at Alaska and Hawaii, which both became states long after the United States had claimed the Philippines. One of the deciding factors in making these territories states likely had to do with the already large percentage of white people living on their lands. This was not true of the Philippines, and it certainly would not have been true of any African colony that the United States would have controlled. The colonial scars of Africa run deep, but the United States did not contribute substantially to the atrocities carried out across the continent during this phase of world history. That being said, the U.S. did the same thing that European powers were doing in Africa, just on the North American continent, the Caribbean, and in the Pacific. It was these territories that provided strategic significance and financial opportunity for the U.S., and this is why places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and numerous other islands became colonies of the United States. And now I have a confession to make. I was recently hanging out with a group of friends when one of them introduced me to his new girlfriend. Turns out that she was from a Spanish-speaking country, and soon everyone was speaking in her native tongue. Everyone, that is, except for me. All I could do was stand there, trying my best to remember my high school Spanish classes. After that, I decided it was time to make a change, which is why I'm so grateful to the sponsor of today's video, Babbel. Babbel is a scientifically proven system to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. And you won't know a bunch of random nouns like gato, which means cat by the way. Instead, Babbel prepares you for real-world conversations with lessons about practical topics like travel, business, relationships, and more. A few weeks later, I ended up seeing the same friends, and this time I was ready. Hola, yo soy infographic show narrador. Un momento, ¿dónde está mi gato? So which language are you going to learn? Tell me in the comments and then start learning it in just 3 weeks with Babbel by using the link in the description to get 60% off your subscription. Now watch how humanity will actually colonize Mars year by year, or check out actual reason why Spartan Empire went extinct.